The diary appeared out of nowhere. Elena found it in the attic of her grandmother's house, buried beneath a pile of moth-eaten blankets and dusty photo albums. It was a plain book, bound in dark leather, with no title or markings on the cover. The pages were yellowed, rough to the touch, and completely blank. Yet, there was something about it, something that made her skin crawl, and her heart race the moment her fingers brushed its surface. She should have left it there, should have turned away and forgotten it existed. But curiosity has a way of wrapping its claws around you. The first night she brought it home, she left it on her nightstand. It sat there, innocuous yet unnervingly present, as if it were watching her. She tossed and turned, plagued by dreams she couldn't remember. When she woke, her throat dry and her chest heavy, she saw it. The diary was open, and there was writing on the page. The ink was a deep crimson, like fresh blood, and the letters were sharp, jagged, as though carved by something with claws. The words read, "Welcome, Elena." Her blood turned to ice. She hadn't written that. She hadn't even touched the thing since bringing it home. With trembling hands, she flipped through the pages, her heart pounding louder with each turn. They were still blank, except for the first page. That night, Elena locked the diary in her desk drawer. But it didn't stay there. The next morning, it was on her bed, wide open. This time, the message had changed. "You can't ignore me." She threw it across the room. It hit the wall with a dull thud and landed face down on the floor. But when she dared to pick it up, the diary was pristine, not a single mark on it. She decided to burn it. The flames roared in the fireplace, devouring the logs she threw on top of the diary. But the leather cover didn't char, and the pages didn't curl. The fire seemed to retreat from it, shrinking back like a wounded animal. Elena's desperation turned to dread. The diary had claimed her. That night, she dreamt of shadows. 100 faceless figures gathered around her bed, whispering in a language she couldn't understand. One of them stepped closer, its voice rasping like rusted metal. "You'll write, or you'll bleed." When she woke, the diary was in her lap, a pen balanced delicately on top of it. Her trembling fingers picked up the pen as if they weren't her own. She didn't want to write. Every fiber of her being screamed against it. But as soon as the tip touched the paper, the words flowed, dark, violent, twisted things she couldn't control. Stories of pain, death, and madness poured out of her, line after line, until her hand cramped and her vision blurred. When she finally stopped, she realized the ink was red, and her palm was bleeding. Each day, the diary demanded more. It was never satisfied. The stories grew darker, the visions more vivid. Elena started hearing voices in the house, whispers coming from the walls, laughter echoing from empty rooms. She stopped eating, stopped sleeping. Her world became the diary. Then the nightmares began bleeding into reality. One morning, she found scratch marks on her bedroom door, deep gouges as though made by claws. The next day, a shadow slithered across her living room wall, even though there was nothing there to cast it. And every night, the diary waited. "Write, or you'll bleed." By the third week, Elena wasn't sure what was real anymore. Her reflection in the mirror stared back at her with hollow eyes, her skin pallid and stretched tight over her bones. She tried to leave the house, but her legs wouldn't move past the threshold, as though invisible hands were holding her back. The diary was consuming her, one page at a time. Elena thought of running. She thought of packing a bag and leaving everything behind. The diary, the house, the nightmares. But deep down, she knew it wouldn't matter. The diary had latched onto her like a parasite, and wherever she went, it would follow. On the fourth week, she discovered something new. The diary had started writing ****. It happened late one night when she was compelled to write. Her hand moved against her will, feverishly scrawling a story about a man lost in the woods. In her vision, she saw him stumble upon a cabin filled with grotesque, disfigured bodies, each one more mangled than the last. They were nailed to the walls, their mouths sewn shut, their hollow eyes staring into nothingness. When she finished the story, the words shimmered on the page. For a brief moment, they seemed to writhe, like worms burrowing into the paper. Then, beneath her final sentence, new words appeared. "The cabin is real. Would you like to visit?" Elena slammed the diary shut and threw it across the room. But when she turned back, it was on the desk in front of her, open to the same page. The question glared at her, the crimson ink almost glowing in the dim light of a bedroom. She whispered, "No," her voice trembling. The diary laughed, not in words, but with a sound. A low, guttural chuckle echoed from the pages, as if something deep and ancient was mocking her. That night, the shadows in her room were alive. They moved in ways shadows shouldn't, crawling up the walls, slithering across the floor, pooling beneath her bed. She could hear them whispering her name. "Elena, Elena, write for us." By the 5th week, her physical body was deteriorating. Her fingernails had started cracking, her skin peeling at the edges. She coughed up black sludge every morning, and her veins looked darker, almost as if the blood inside her was thickening into tar. But she couldn't stop writing. One night, the diary forced her to write about her grandmother's death. The story unfolded without her consent. She wrote about a night Elena had never experienced, a memory that wasn't hers. In this story, her grandmother was dragged into the forest by something with too many eyes and limbs that bent the wrong way. She screamed, but the thing dragged her deeper and deeper until her voice was swallowed by the trees. When she finished, the diary flipped itself shut, as if satisfied. The next morning, Elena decided she needed answers. She drove to the library in town, though her hand shook so badly she nearly crashed twice. There, she buried herself in old records, desperate to find any mention of a cursed diary. Hours passed before she stumbled upon a newspaper article from the 1920s. The headline read, "Massacre at Blackwood Manor. Family found dead. Words etched in blood." Her breath caught. The accompanying photo showed a man sitting at a desk, a leather-bound diary in front of him. The same diary. The article described a horrific scene. The entire Blackwood family, 9 people in total, had been found dead in their home. Their bodies were mutilated, their faces frozen in expressions of terror. The walls of the manor were covered in writing, messages scrawled in blood. Investigators claimed it was human blood, though they could never determine whose. At the center of it all was the diary. The article claimed it vanished shortly after the investigation, along with all evidence collected from the scene. The lead investigator, Detective Harold Green, had reportedly gone mad, ranting about shadows that whispered to him in the dark. He was found dead a week later, his body hanging in his attic, with the words, "I couldn't stop writing," carved into his chest. Elena left the library in a daze. She knew now that the diary couldn't be destroyed, but perhaps she could understand it, find a way to break its hold. When she returned home, the diary was waiting for her on the coffee table. Its cover gleamed, as though it had been polished. The air around it felt thick, suffocating. It opened by itself. The words appeared instantly. "You've learned the truth. Now, write it down." That night, the diary showed her the cabin from her earlier story. It wasn't just a vision this time. She could feel the icy wind on her face, smell the stench of rotting flesh emanating from within. The shadows pulled her toward the cabin, whispering promises of freedom if she obeyed. Inside, she saw the disfigured bodies again, but now they were moving. Their heads turned to follow her, their sewn mouths stretching as though they were trying to scream. One of them raised a hand and pointed to the desk in the corner, where the diary waited for her. Her knees buckled as she sat down. The pen was already there, stained with blood. And then she wrote. This time, she didn't write about someone else's nightmare. She wrote about hers. The diary didn't stop her after that night. The entries became darker, more violent, and more personal. And with every story, the line between reality and fiction blurred. One night, Elena wrote about her own death, her body hanging in the attic, with words carved into her skin. When she finished, the diary whispered. Soon, by the 6th week, Elena had become a shell of her former self. Her once vibrant brown eyes were dull, sunken into her face. Her hair, once thick and lively, now hung in brittle strands. She hadn't eaten in days, hadn't slept for longer. The diary didn't allow it. Every time she tried to close her eyes, the visions came. Shadowy figures loomed over her bed, their distorted faces pressed close to hers, whispering things that made her ears bleed. When she covered her ears, the whispers didn't stop. They were inside her head now, curling around her thoughts like vines. The diary demanded more, and she gave in every time. That night, she wrote about her parents. The pen moved frantically, scraping across the paper as it described a scene she had never lived. In the story, her parents were arguing in the kitchen, their voices sharp and venomous. Elena's father reached for a knife. Her mother screamed, her voice echoing as the blade pierced her chest. Blood splattered across the walls, pulling on the tiled floor. Her father turned to Elena, the knife dripping in his hand, his face twisted into something monstrous. When she finished, her hands trembled. The words on the page seemed alive, pulsing like a heartbeat. And then, she heard a knock at the door. Her entire body froze. It was almost midnight. Who would be knocking at this hour? She moved slowly, her legs stiff, as though her body was resisting her. The knock came again, louder this time, more urgent. When she opened the door, she saw nothing. The porch was empty, the street silent except for the faint rustle of the wind. But when she looked down, she saw something that made her stomach twist. A knife, its blade gleaming with fresh blood, rested on the doormat. She slammed the door shut, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might burst. She locked it, deadbolt, chain, everything. But as she turned around, she gasped. The diary was waiting for her, open on the coffee table. The words on the page read, "It's time to finish the story." The 7th week brought the final unraveling of her reality. Elena no longer trusted her senses. The house had changed. It no longer felt like her own. The walls seemed to shift when she wasn't looking. The rooms growing longer, darker, more twisted. The whispers were constant now, even during the day. They called her name, taunted her, begged her to write. Her reflection in the mirror was no longer hers. When she looked, she saw something else staring back. A gaunt, hollow-eyed version of herself with a twisted smile and blood dripping from its mouth. The diary was relentless. One night, it forced her to write about her own funeral. The words came unbidden, flowing like a torrent. She described the mourners dressed in black, their faces solemn as they stood around an open grave. She wrote about the casket, polished mahogany, with a name engraved on a golden plaque. She wrote about her mother's sobs, her father's silence, the priest's monotonous voice reciting a prayer. And then she wrote about the moment the casket opened. Inside, her corpse stared up at the mourners, its eyes wide and filled with terror. Her hands were clawed, as if she had tried to fight her way out. Her lips moved, forming silent words that no one could understand. When she finished, the diary whispered, "Prepare yourself." The nightmares became unbearable. Elena woke up one night to find herself standing in the middle of her bedroom, clutching the bloody knife that had appeared on her doorstep. She had no memory of how she got there. The diary was on the bed, open, its pages filled with words she didn't remember writing. The words described a scene she couldn't comprehend. Her neighbor, Mrs. Harper, lying in her living room, her throat slit, her lifeless eyes staring at the ceiling. The description was vivid, too vivid. Elena dropped the knife and stumbled back, her breathing ragged. The next morning, the news confirmed what the diary had written. Mrs. Harper had been found dead, murdered in her home. The details matched Elena's story exactly. She tried to turn herself in. She walked into the police station, the diary clutched in her trembling hands. But when she tried to speak, no sound came out. Her throat burned, as if an invisible hand was choking her. The officers stared at her, their faces blurring, their voices a cacophony of distorted murmurs. When she looked down, the diary was gone. It was back on her desk when she returned home. By the 8th week, Elena knew she was trapped. The diary didn't just want her stories. It wanted her life. It was feeding on her, draining her essence with every word she wrote. The final message appeared one night, scrawled across the page in jagged, crimson letters. "You are the story now." The shadows came for her that night. They spilled out of the walls, slithering across the floor like liquid darkness. They wrapped around her, their touch cold and suffocating. She tried to scream, but her voice was stolen. The diary sat open on the desk, glowing faintly as the shadows dragged her toward it. And then, she was gone. The diary fell silent, its pages blank once more. Weeks later, a new family moved into the house. Their teenage son, curious and adventurous, found an old leather-bound diary in the attic. It looked ordinary, but something about it drew him in. When he opened it, he saw the first page filled with crimson ink. It read, "Welcome, James." James wasn't the type to scare easily. At 16, he had an adventurous spirit and an insatiable curiosity. So when he found the old leather-bound diary in the attic of his family's new home, he thought it was just another forgotten relic of the house's history. The first page intrigued him. "Welcome, James." He chuckled nervously, running his fingers over the words. "Okay, that's creepy," he muttered. He tried to convince himself it was a coincidence, maybe something left behind by the previous owner. But the ink, it was strange, dark, sticky, almost fresh. He decided to keep the diary. That night, he placed it on his nightstand and went to sleep. When he woke, the diary was on his chest, open. A new message stared up at him. "Write your truth, James." He frowned, but a strange feeling settled over him, an inexplicable pull to obey. Shrugging it off as his imagination, he grabbed a pen and scribbled lazily. "Hi, my name is James. I just moved into this creepy house with my parents. I'm not sure. I like it here." As soon as he finished the sentence, the ink shimmered. The words twisted and warped, rearranging themselves on the page. His harmless introduction morphed into something sinister. "Hi, my name is James. I just moved into your house. I'm not sure I'll survive it." His hands trembled. He slammed the diary shut and shoved it under his bed. But deep down, he felt the first tendrils of dread curling around him. Over the next few days, strange things began happening. James noticed subtle changes around the house. The air felt heavier, and the walls seemed to hum softly, as if alive. At night, he heard whispers. Faint, indistinct voices drifted through the halls, growing louder whenever he was near the attic door. One morning, he found scratch marks on his bedroom window, deep gouges that hadn't been there before. He tried to ignore it, but the diary wouldn't let him. Every night, it appeared somewhere new, on his desk, under his pillow, even in the shower. Each time, it had a fresh message waiting for him. "Right, James, the house is listening. We are watching you." One night, James decided to confront the diary. Armed with a flashlight and his phone, he sat at his desk, staring at the book. "What do you want from me?" he whispered, his voice cracking. The diary flipped open on its own. The pen rolled toward his hand. His fingers trembled as he picked it up, the compulsion overwhelming him. He started writing, his hand moving faster than his thoughts. The words poured out in a frenzy, describing events he couldn't explain, memories that weren't his. She screamed as the shadows dragged her into the walls. Her blood stained the floor, but no one heard her cries. The room grew colder with each sentence. His breath came in short, sharp gasps, visible in the freezing air. When he stopped writing, the diary whispered, "Good, James. Now, do you want to see it?" Before he could answer, the attic door slammed open. James grabbed his flashlight and crept upstairs, each step feeling heavier than the last. The attic was suffocating dark, but something gleamed in the far corner, a faint red glow, pulsing like a heartbeat. He moved closer, the light trembling in his hand. The glow was coming from the floorboards, which were stained dark and sticky. A strange, metallic smell filled the air. He realized with a start that it was blood. Then he heard it. A low, guttural moan echoed through the attic, followed by the sound of something scraping against the walls. James whipped around, his flashlight beam bouncing off the shadows. "Who's there?" he shouted, his voice cracking. The shadows moved. They slithered across the floor, climbing the walls, surrounding him. He felt them brush against his skin, cold, slimy, alive. And then he saw her. A woman stepped out of the darkness, her face pale and her eyes hollow sockets. Her body was mangled, Her limbs twisted at unnatural angles. Blood dripped from her fingers, staining the floor with every step she took. James recognized her. She was the woman from the diary. "Elena," he whispered. She tilted her head, a grotesque smile stretching across her face. "You'll finish the story," she rasped. Her voice was broken, like shattered glass grinding together. "Or the house will finish you." James ran, but the house seemed to shift around him. The stairs stretched into an endless spiral, the walls closing in. The whispers grew louder, overlapping until they became a deafening roar. When he finally stumbled into his bedroom, the diary was waiting for him on the bed. It was open to a blank page, the pen hovering above it. He grabbed it, desperate to end the nightmare. The story that came out was no longer his. He wrote of his own death, his screams as the shadows consumed him, his body torn apart and left to rot in the attic. He wrote about his parents finding the diary weeks later, their curiosity leading them down the same dark path. He wrote until the words blurred together, his vision fading. When he finally stopped, the diary whispered, "Welcome to the story, James." The next day, James's parents found his room empty. The only thing left behind was the diary, sitting on the desk, with the words, "Welcome, Karen." His mother picked it up, her brow furrowing as she opened to the first page. And so, the cycle continued. The diary never stopped. It never would. It was alive, feeding on fear, blood, and stories that were never meant to be told. The house remained, silent and waiting for its next victim. And in the shadows, something smiled.